looking at Giotto or looking at Botticelli, is to essentially kind of break down just exactly how many colors, primary colors, are being used in the actual scenes, because it is a very limited amount. And so it's up to the artist to somehow compensate and to combine those colors in particular ways so that the viewer doesn't in fact notice. And when we look at Giotto's works, and I want you to notice the date, I apologize for that wire there hanging in front, but you'll see it starts in 1303, 2 years to complete in 1305. And of course, one of Giotto's main objectives was to make his painting look realistic and naturalistic. And as we all know, we need to translate our three-dimensional world into the two dimensions of the painting. And so what Giotto did so effectively with his colors was to use them to actually model his figures, model more specifically his drapery, so that when you look at these colors, these yellows and these pinks and these reds or what have you, look how the softer parts, of course, represent the highlighting, the parts of the bodies that are projecting out furthest and therefore touched by the light, whereas the truer values of those colors instead suggest shadow. And so he's literally using color to sculpt his figures, to give them a sense of three-dimensionality, of volume as well. And he does it all throughout the chapel. Okay? So that, of course, we're so smitten with his ability to tell a story, and it's compelling psychology and emotion and its humor as well. But if we actually start looking at the way Giotto manipulates colors in his works, particularly down here. Okay, now these are three figures that I've shown so often in my lectures to illustrate Giotto's attempt at capturing animation in his art. Okay, that is one distinct action, which is the removal of the robe through three different figures. But again, look at how he manipulates that color, the pink to the green and sort of off-white, down here to that kind of pinkish hue, to the blue robe that's down there as well. Those colors help our eyes move through, okay, this sequential motion of the first figure pulling the robe off of his elbow, the other figure kind of has it stuck there on his or her head, and then that third figure laying it down. Okay, these are, as Bonnie mentioned, these are conscious decisions made by the artist to try to have that color complement the objective that they're trying to obtain in their art. But of course, it wasn't just about technique. It wasn't just about making figures look three-dimensional. The colors also helped the viewer understand the story. So that one of the more powerful scenes in the Sistine Chapel is in fact the Pact of Judas. Right? Now, I'm often talking about the humanity of this particular scene because Judas looks rather simpatico, as the Italians say, right? He's not this evil-looking, sinister figure, but clearly the figure behind him is, right? And the idea that he was somehow motivated to do this by the devil. But more importantly, the color of his robe, right? Yellow. Because in medieval art, the bad guys usually wear yellow. And in a society that was rather openly anti-Semitic, right? That color was also used to identify people of Jewish origin as well. And so the idea that someone looking, I mean, it's almost the equivalent of us watching a Western, and the guy with the black hat is the bad guy in the scene, so that he dresses Judas in yellow, so from this point on, his audience will know that he is up to no good. And so we see him there dressed in yellow, and then of course we see that yellow robe again, but now in a much more powerful light. In the Kiss of Judas, which I've always maintained is arguably the most powerful scene of all time, because not only is Judas ironically betraying Christ with a kiss, so this gesture of affection turns into a gesture instead of betrayal, but look how he envelops Christ, overwhelms Christ with that yellow robe. So evil has won the day. Evil has overshadowed good. Now, is this me making it up? Is this me superimposing what I want it to be on Giotto's artwork? I think not, because despite all of the technical limitations that Giotto had at the beginning of the 14th century, he's that sophisticated an artist, right? Think of Schindler's List and that red that continue to appear throughout. I mean, the colors can be so powerful and so effective, and I'm certain that Giotto was aware of that in his rendering of this particular scene. Or in his lamentation of Jesus Christ, this incredibly powerful image of these figures lamenting the death of Christ. Look at that dramatic assembly of angels up above. But the figure that has always captured my eye more than any other is, in fact, the figure of St. John, the beloved apostle. Okay? Because when you look at him up close, look how three-dimensional that drapery appears to be. I mean, you really do get the impression that if you were to rub the surface of the wall, and for the love of God, do not attempt to rub the surface of the wall if you visit the Sistine Chapel, but that you would feel. You know, Bonnie mentioned Frank Stella talking about, you know, why does painting have to be on a flat plane or what have you, and clearly Giotto didn't think that it had to be either, because he's manipulating that 2D surface to look convincingly 3D. And in fact, in the description of the color field exhibition, Frank Stella's description of artists and their direct manipulation of color, which is exactly what Giotto is doing, and it's exactly what Giotto has to do at the beginning of the 14th century, where essentially, I mean, we're at the beginnings of it all. Because remember, Giotto did not have the luxury of looking back at ancient Greco-Roman painting for inspiration. And the reason is because there wasn't any Greco-Roman painting for him to look at. So he has to kind of invent it on his own. And what he does is to kind of lay the foundation for, in fact, the tastes of color for the subsequent 3 or 4 centuries. In fact, if any of you have been to the cathedral in San Gimignano, now let's all say that together. San Gimignano. I think if you do follow me, you indeed know that one of my pet peeves is that all of you learn how to pronounce the name of that Tuscan hill town. I get all sorts of mutilations. Sometimes I just get total avoidance of the pronunciation, so that, oh yeah, we were in San Gimignano yesterday and we had a really great time. San Gimignano. If you truly are a follower of mine, you'll learn how to pronounce that name. And the cathedral in San Gimignano, which actually is a Romanesque church from the 12th century, is really dark. And so there we have an artist, albeit a mysterious artist, by the name of Barna da Siena, who actually needs to use color to make his frescoes more visible to the viewer. And I remember the old days when we would travel to San Gimignano with our undergraduates, and we'd walk into the church, and it was just pitch black inside. And so we'd have to find the little machine where you'd put the coins, and then suddenly the lights would come on and they would come to life. Now the lights are on all the time and you have to pay admission. But the church being so dark, and the artist aware of that, so that he's taking what Giotto did with those sort of highlights to the next level. And he's mixing these colors, these pinks and these greens, these ochres that you see in an almost obnoxious way when you're actually inside the church and they're illuminated, which is why you do need to see this artwork, okay, in situ and under the same conditions that the audience did in the 14th century. And that is without electric lighting, but just candles and torches. But the idea that color also became a means to increase visibility in certain contexts where the paintings were in fact displayed. We think of Masaccio, and you're going to notice that I'm moving here now chronologically, because of course I'm obsessive about that, but it's important because Masaccio now in the early 1400s, the artist who was responsible for inventing what today we define as Renaissance painting, and learning from Giotto in that ability to use light and shade on these colors. And again, look at that. They're all more or less just the same colors that are rearranged. All right? And again, it's a rather limiting type of variety of color, and then it's up to the artist to create invention so that he can mix and match. But look at the way the pinks and the blues, the purple highlighted on the shoulder. And so we got that sense of volume, of cylindrical forms, of sculpture. And that's what they're doing. The colors become a veritable means to sculpt these figures in the artwork that they produce. And whether it's in fresco, like we see here, or in a panel painting. Okay? Now consider that in central Italy, Okay, and we're talking about Florence and Rome. When they're painting on wooden surfaces, what they're doing is essentially suspending the same kind of pigment, but in egg or in glue, and then applying to a prepared surface. Usually in Florence, we're using poplar wood, which is covered with gypsum, right? And that is the preparation. But when you look at an image like this, which is in the National Gallery, it was the central piece of this massive altarpiece that Masaccio did for a church in Pisa. She is not the most handsome of Virgin Marys, right? That I accept and admit willingly, but look at the richness of that blue mantle that she wears. Okay? Painted in a very expensive pigment called lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan and worth almost as much as gold in the 14th century. And in fact, if any of you are artists today, you know that lapis lazuli is still very expensive to buy in art supply stores. And you can see that Masaccio, even though the painting is not in a great state of conservation, look at how the light and the darker parts of that mantle really create a convincing sense of three-dimensionality, of folds, of a body actually supporting it as well, and the red that we see underneath and the richness of it, even through all the deterioration that's actually there. And so these colors both dressing the figures, but at the same time giving life to the figures and making them three-dimensional in form. In a few weeks, I will be in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and one of the pieces that I adore talking about is another piece of that Masaccio altarpiece that's now in the collection. And it's just a single painting of St. Andrew, but look at the monumentality. I mean, it's astounding. This thing's about a foot tall. It's not very large at all, but when you see the different intensities of green, from the more illuminated to the more shaded parts, and again, just like that Giotto St. John the Beloved, you get the impression that if you were to rub the surface, and again, for the love of God, don't do it, that you would feel the different planes of space that he's able to create using these various fields of light, these rich greens, simple, but at the same time incredibly complex in how the figures are represented. And then, of course, another member of this first generation of early Renaissance art, the great Fra Angelico. Okay, now I think some of you know this story, but I think it's worth repeating. Fra Angelico, who is one of the most important artists of the first half of the 15th century, who is known to the Italians as Beato Angelico, because in fact he was beatified in 1992 by Saint Pope John Paul II. And the only reason I mention this is because if any of you fall in love with Fra Angelico today, purchase a plane ticket, fly across the Atlantic, go to Florence, and to the Museum of San Marco, which is nothing less than a shrine to this particular artist. It's the greatest assembly of artwork by him. I once had a man who did just that, and when I spoke to him and said, so how was it? How was your experience at San Marco? You must have been ecstatic to see all those paintings by Fra Angelico. And he said, no, I was terribly disappointed because none of the paintings were by Fra Angelico. And I said, what do you mean? They're all by Fra Angelico. He said, no, all the tags read Beato Angelico instead, right? Anyway, so it's the same guy, technically speaking. Now, this is a painting that was actually begun by Fra Angelico's teacher, whose name was Lorenzo Monaco, Lawrence the monk. And Lawrence the monk, who was also an ecclesiastic, was very, very capable in using colors in a very kind of expressive way, and in fact transmitted that to his student, the Dominican priest painter Fra Angelico, who is just extraordinary. Look at these pastelish colors. It looks like he's working in pastels in the early 15th century, but remember, pastels won't really come around for another 3 centuries. But learning from Masaccio and learning from Giotto before him, these incredibly soft, bright colors, it's the same essential pigments that all other artists were using at the time, but clearly Fra Angelico's visual language is one that's more emphatic of the softness of these tones. And you can see just how this arrangement of figures, I mean, of course, we're all looking at the removal of Christ's body, but you could almost just abstract those colors out and appreciate it for its pure aesthetic value. These are the artists who are laying the foundation, again, for the taste in chromatism for centuries to come. Botticelli. Right, Bonnie mentioned Botticelli, and of course, Botticelli is celebrated for so many different innovations in his artwork, but color should rank amongst the top as well. Now, this is this massive detached fresco, which today is located in the Uffizi Gallery, but was once in the extant hospital in Florence called Santa Maria della Scala. And again, the overall effect is subdued in terms of the kind of domestic setting, the landscape quite simple, but just certain areas where the color suddenly comes to life, like the orange of Gabriel's robe here wrapped around, contrasting with the white of the robe that he wears underneath. Look at the light blue highlighting of the wingtips that you have here as well. Mary over, dressed in her conventional blue, but you'll note that the inner lining of the blue is actually green. And so using these primary colors juxtaposed against each other and then hiding that rich Bordeaux that we see on the inside, which is just extraordinary. Right? Adding life to their works by using these colors to really pinpoint the two main figures in an otherwise kind of somber type of setting. Right? Or a painting like this. And now obviously on a prepared wooden panel, the intensity of the color is going to be greater. And so we can see now Botticelli using that rich lapis lazuli for the blue mantle of the Virgin Mary and the red that we see underneath. Okay, blue and red, which of course are the traditional colors of Mary. The blue representing divinity, the red representing both royalty, but also the temporal. And so the divine in the blue, the red instead, the earthy, if you will. And then look at that silk scarf that she wears around her neck and the contrasts of the pink and the blues. And then these wingless angels, because they don't need wings, right? They're so rarefied in their androgyny that I think they couldn't be anything but angels in that intense yellow against the deep blue, against the embroidered kind of Bordeaux of the sleeve that you see there as well. And so the idea that it is figurative art. I mean, these are narratives. Here, Mary writing her song, the so-called Magnificat. But at the same time, it is that arrangement of color fields which just make the painting aesthetically pleasing. It's not just the beauty of the figures, but it's also, of course, the colors that they wear that make it such an attractive work of art. And even a painting like this. All right? Now, sorry about that. Painting like this, the Birth of Venus, which, of course, we always celebrate for its innovative subject matter. It is one of the earliest examples that we have of mythological subject matter in Renaissance art. Okay? Now, again, it's worth pausing for a second to mention that almost the entire 15th century was essentially a kind of classicizing style. In other words, making buildings, making sculpture, and making paintings look like ancient buildings, sculptures, and paintings. But the subject matter had remained Christian, because that was essentially the pretense for all of it. And then Botticelli comes along and opens up this Pandora's box when he begins to depict mythological subjects. Now, of course, you're all sitting back and yawning, saying, well, what is the big deal? But remember, the big deal is that in the 15th century, if someone were to walk into your home and see a large painting of a nude pagan goddess hanging on the wall, it was just one quick phone call. The 1-800-Inquisition hotline, right? People have been burned alive for a lot less than this. And so the idea that essentially you also needed an important patron behind the work of art, and in this case, that patron was named Medici. But that revolution in iconography and subject matter was also accompanied by this revolution in chromatism and in color, because Botticelli had to invent the visual language for this otherworldly subject matter. Okay, you can't really use the stuff we've been using in Christianity because this isn't Christian subject matter, right? It has to come across in a different way. And so one of the things that I've always commented on in regards to this particular painting is its abstraction. It's incredibly flat, right? In the sense that all you get is 2/3 water, which is just a slightly varied intensity of blue, then 1/3 sky, that sliver of green running up on the side to give you a sense of depth, and then essentially, just these skin tones that we see with that light blue worn by Zephyr, that pink that you see in the arms of Spring over there on the right-hand side. Almost as if he's trying to subdue the colors, because what we've been seeing in the Giottos and in the Masaccios and the Fra Angelicos is an attempt to make it look more real, where Botticelli's working in the opposite direction. He wants it to make this look more surreal, or supernatural, if you will. And so he creates this world where the colors themselves are not as intense, perhaps, as we've seen in the work of his predecessors, but that lending to this kind of otherworldly concept, to this abstract world where figures are frozen in space to communicate the nature of the subject more effectively at the time. Bonnie caught herself when she said Leonardo, and she said, oh, well, not so much Leonardo. And folks, I want you to realize that it's true. Leonardo was not the most successful of colorists. All right? The intensity of his colors was always controlled. Some might even say subdued. So even in a painting like this, the Annunciation, which he painted at the whopping age of 20, by the way, look at the low saturation red. Right? So it's red mixed with a lot of black. Now, that doesn't make it bad, per se. It just makes him different from what other artists were doing. Personally, I adore that velvet quality that comes across, that you can feel the weight of the red simply through its mixing with the black. Look at the green. So sort of what Botticelli did earlier. So that green is the inner lining of the red. And that lining is green. Now, the reproduction is not coming across perfectly faithfully, but it's highlighted in yellow. Right? Now, we, of course, all know the color wheel and how colors work. Green, of course, is a cold color that optically moves away from you, whereas yellow is a hot one instead. And so he's balancing those two optical effects. That blue that Botticelli used for the wingtips is also used by Leonardo right here. Look at the way he just touches it. You really have to consciously look for it as well. Mary wearing her traditional blue and red, but now with the yellow lining also, the deep red that we see inside. He's not using color for expression. It's not expressive in that sense, but he is mixing these colors in a very sophisticated, again, in controlled, in subdued way. In fact, I thought about putting it into the lecture and then I decided to exclude it, but The Last Supper by Leonardo. All right? I opened up by saying that fresco was a limiting medium for colorists because there are only certain colors, which is why Leonardo decided not to paint The Last Supper in fresco, but to opt for a disastrous dry method, right, the a secco, so that he could apply all the colors that he wanted, only to have those colors fall off the wall within mere years of the painting being executed. Right? And so the idea essentially of different artists approaching their colors in different ways. And clearly, other artists, right, were very interested in the expressive power of color. This might just be my favorite painting by Italian Renaissance artists at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And I know some of you have been there with me when we go through the great masterpieces in the collection. And the reason, and those of you who know me know I'm not a big color guy. I appreciate them, but it's not usually the first thing that I look at when I look at a painting. But the intensity of Mary's outfit, it's the first thing you notice when you walk into the room, that lapis that just screams at you from inside of the painting, and the way it both contrasts and complements the red of Mary's robe underneath. Look at the transparency of that light blue veil that she wears, that deep silk velvety cushion that you see. And so the notion that, oh yeah, it's another Madonna and Child, one of the many, but of course the way these colors are put together and arranged where essentially the expressivity of those colors almost supersedes the very subject that the artist is painting. Right? Bonnie mentioned Michelangelo. Okay? Now, think about this. This is a guy who's used to working in monochrome white marble. Because in the Renaissance, most sculptors thought that ancient statues were also monochrome and white. Right? When in reality, we today know that many of those statues were painted. If not all of them were painted, it's just that the paint has fallen off of those ancient statues. And so although Michelangelo did not paint his statues, he was one of the most successful colorists in the history of art. In this extraordinary painting known as the Doni Tondo, which is one of 4 easel paintings that exist in the world by Michelangelo today. There are the 2 unfinished works in the National Gallery in London and the Torment of St. Anthony, which is in the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. But this is the one that, again, just screams at you in the way these colors are combined. Now, one interesting note, Michelangelo's painting this Holy Family image for a very wealthy textile merchant named Angelo Doni. See the name, the Doni Tondo? Right, Tondo means round. Doni was the family name of the patron. And Doni had made his fortune through the sale of certain types of silk fabrics, which were called cangiante silks. Silks woven in Asia with different color warps and wefts, so that technically when you looked at the fabric in one direction, it had a certain color, and then you moved it and another color would be revealed. And that's exactly the same type of color combos that Michelangelo is using here. And so some say that perhaps Michelangelo not as innovative as we'd like to think, and that his inspiration actually came from the driving trends and fashions of his particular day. One of my students, actually, who was a fashion student, once wrote a very convincing paper saying that it was the fashion that drove Michelangelo's colors and not the colors that drove the fashion per se. And she proposed that the patron was doing what we do so often today, and that is dressing the Holy Family in his brand. You follow? I mean, what better endorsement? You know, forget LeBron James. Who needs Lionel Messi, right? When you have Jesus Christ, and the Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph wearing these very fabrics. And when you look at this painting, and I know many of you have seen it in person, the yellow through the orange and into the red, okay? The almost white through the pinks and then almost to purple to render the different degrees of projection. He's using colors to sculpt, because as much as we celebrate Michelangelo as a sculptor, he, of course, was an avid student of all the artists that I've shown you up to this point, Giotto and Masaccio in particular, and learning how to use colors to create these expressive and convincing sculptural forms. Now, one quick parenthesis or footnote. If you remember the old room where the Doni Tondo was displayed before they rearranged everything, this painting was directly opposite it. And everyone walked in the room, and we would look at the Michelangelo, and I'd go on about how he revolutionized iconography and color and what have you as well, and everyone would ask, well, what's that painting there? Because you can see, of course, that this visitation painting by an artist that you have probably never heard of before and will most likely never hear of again after today, by the name of Mariotto Albertinelli, clearly using those chromatic innovations introduced by Michelangelo in particular. Look how similar that yellow from 1506, 1507 looks to this yellow that we see there. So clearly Michelangelo was not the only artist at that time using these particularly intense and vibrant colors in the artwork that was being produced. But of course, Michelangelo was the first to do it on a monumental scale. Okay? Now, it's all about visibility. It's all about how many people are actually exposed to what you do. And so when Michelangelo climbed up on the scaffolding of the Sistine Chapel in 1508 and began painting the 6,000 square feet of ceiling surface and revolutionizing the history of painting. You know, we're all so caught up again on the iconographic innovations. Oh my God, Michelangelo has reinvented the Genesis story of how God created Adam. But there's so much more going on in the scene, so much more that we usually don't have time to get to because there's so much to talk about. But if you start cropping the individual figures, the prophets and the sibyls on the side walls, I mean, you're looking at a visual revolution in regards to color. Daniel is my favorite of all the prophets. I mean, not just because of his power and the way he turns, but look at that yellow fade to green. Look at that white go to this intense kind of purple. Look how he's using yellow and green to show shading. It's what he introduced in the Doni Tondo brought to a new extreme. And the last thing that people would expect Michelangelo to be is a colorist. But folks, he was one of the most successful and revolutionary in the history of art. Look at the Libyan Sibyl. The same thing with her dress. Okay, now some of these colors are a bit washed through the reproduction, but when you get real high resolution imagery, you can see that sort of orange that's been spotlighted here, and then this weird kind of pinkish tone that we see on the inside, which for me is as impressive as the muscular power of the back of the Libyan Sibyl. Or perhaps the most overlooked part of the entire Sistine Chapel ceiling, and that is the lunettes. Okay? On the side. Next time you're in there, I don't know if any of you are coming with me, in October or November, right here, above the windows, are these arched spaces, right? And these are called the lunettes because they have this sort of half-moon shape. And every one of these can be considered a revolution in the history of color. The figure on the left, now we're not even sure exactly what they're supposed to represent. The names that you see here are the names of the ancestors of Jesus Christ. If you've ever picked up the Gospel of Matthew, it begins in an incredibly tedious way by naming the 3 sets of 14 generations. So-and-so was the father of so-and-so, was the father of so-and-so, tracing Christ's lineage all the way back to Abraham. Well, these are the names that appear in the Gospel of Matthew, but the figures that Michelangelo represents are not all men, as they should be, because the names are, in fact, all masculine names. So it almost appears that this is a place where Michelangelo kind of lets loose and perhaps even begins to experiment with his colors, these cangiante colors that we saw in that circular painting that we saw in the prophets and sibyls. Look at it here, the green dress, and then that striking light falling out. But it's not really light, it's just a whiter area of the dress that she's actually wearing. Or these two figures. I mean, they're just modern in their rendering of color, from the red of the dress to the orange to the yellow to the green that covers her there. Or here, I mean, it almost looks like spandex to a certain extent with the stretch. You see that? That it's like this sort of purplish, true viola, kind of lavender type color, but where it's kissed by the light, you could see it just stretching all the way down, the greenish undershirt to the orange sort of skirt that he's wearing that then transforms into the pink that we see there. Overlooked, but absolutely priceless in their rendering of the colors. You know, here are these purple tights on the figure, and just look at the waves of light and shadow falling through across the dress of this figure. The same thing with the female figure that you see there. It's almost as if Michelangelo just unleashes his imagination and explores the potential of all of those colors, which, remember, were a very limited amount of pigments being used at the time. All these artists are going to the same place. They're going to the pharmacy, right, to the apothecaries. They're buying natural pigments that occur in nature. They're stones or they're rocks that are ground down in a mortar and pestle and then applied to whatever surface. But it's how they were combined, it's how they were applied that, of course, made them so extraordinary. And not surprisingly, Raphael, the boy wonder of the High Renaissance, using those same innovative color patterns in his frescoes. And so, of course, we look at a painting like this and we ooh and we ah about this great assembly of classical minds. But when you look up close, you just start to see how extraordinary his color combinations are as well. Look at that range going right through. Look at the inner part of his robe. We go from that kind of green to the purple of Plato's exterior robe, the yellow to the brown to the blue, and then back over as well. You know, there's so much, and our eyes, you know, inevitably, obviously, as an art historian, I'm guilty as well, because our tendency is always to focus on the iconography, on what is being represented, less than how it's being represented, but clearly the innovations here abound. Here's another detail in the lower right-hand corner, and you can see again how these colors are being put together. One of my favorites, look at the blue of the underpart there of this figure's chest, but on its back, presumably the illuminated part, you can see it transform into pink instead. These are these conjunte colors that became so popular at the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries. Raphael does it again in the next room, the room of Heliodorus, where you can see this extraordinary golden glow of the domes up above. And there's so much going on. Again, it's sort of hard to know where your eyes should fall, but I'm about to show you a detail from right here. Oops. Okay, and then again, look at the intensity of that yellow contrasting with the blue of the veil. It's the yellow veil over her head. It's not the yellow of her hair instead. And then, you know, just so much going on in this kaleidoscope of colors that Raphael has painted. And the same thing goes other side. Look at this. Extraordinary. And how far we've come in just a mere couple of centuries, right? From Giotto in the early 14th century to Raphael at the beginning of the 16th century. And then this whole wave of artists that follow, known as Mannerists, right? Mannerism, this great kind of controversial subject in the history of art, of artists who become intentionally unorthodox, or as one art historian described it, the stylish style of Renaissance art, where they're conscientiously trying to create something different. And one of my favorite Mannerists is Andrea del Sarto. This is a painting that not too many people have seen, located in the cloister of the Servite Church of Santissima Annunziata. But I just adore, I mean, one, the beauty of the figures themselves, but the way these colors are combined, the yellow of that blanket over that white sacco, or sack, which is where the painting gets its name. And look how much is going on over here. Just how many colors he's combined in this pyramidal figure of the Virgin with the Christ child on her lap. Clearly, artists are now seeing color as a means by which to express value in the art that they're producing at the time. All right? But when it comes to Italian Renaissance art and color, those artists who are seen to be the champions of chromatism are the Venetians. All right? That is, artists from Venice. Now, consider that Giorgio Vasari laid down the criteria for great painting. He wrote in his Lives of the Artists, if you want to create a great painting, you need three things. Right? First and foremost, he said, you need disegno, draftsmanship. Vasari and the whole Central Italian school of art maintained that draftsmanship, drawing, line, was the basis of all art, because it all kind of went back to sculpture. Then Vasari said you needed ingegno, you needed innovation, right? You needed to do something different from what had been done before. We need originality, right? We need creativity. And then Vasari says the third thing, the third ingredient for great painting is colore, color. And Vasari said that no one does it better than the Venetians. And of course, a name like Bellini needs no introduction. His San Zaccaria altarpiece that you see here, which was done relatively late in his career, but look again how his colors, and mind you, the Venetians using a different medium. Very rarely working in fresco because it's too humid in Venice. Working in tempera for a period of time, but eventually transitioning over to oil on canvas. And that oil allowed them a range of color that was unprecedented in central Italy, but also their transitions, right? Their tonal transitions, which are much more sophisticated and much more expressive than what we've seen in central Italy. And that sfumato, that smoky quality that Leonardo had introduced, which they now bring to a completely different level. It's just an absolutely bewitching use of color. And Bellini is actually one of the more sort of traditional, if you will, of these Venetian colorists, because of course then we start getting guys like Giorgione. And here that sfumato quality, that smokiness with this extraordinary range from the blues and the greens. The river, this body of water that you see, is actually impasto, right? So it's thick paint that he's kind of spatulaed on to the surface, almost as if they're sculpting now with their pigments and with their colors. You see it in this enigmatic painting, which again, we're always so invested in trying to figure out the meaning of, that we lose its aesthetic value. Or a piece here closer to home, one of my favorite in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., this Adoration of the Shepherds, where again you can see this incredibly sophisticated and subtle use of colors and transitions between the different figures and the fabrics and the textures of the image that's being created. Look at these little angel heads that are sort of floating around in space. This is a degree of painting, of use of color, of application of color, which is completely foreign to what was happening in central Italy. And of course, no discussion of color in Renaissance painting is complete unless you mention Tiziano. And we talk about these transitions. Look what he can do with color, everyone. Okay, and so this Rape of Europa, which is at the Gardner Museum in Boston, where essentially the nymph is being whisked away by Zeus in the form of the bull. Yeah, there's a narrative that's taking place, but it's just bravura, it's virtuosity in action, the intensity of the blue up there in the sky. Look at the light of the sun coming through on those clouds, that red that just kind of captures your attention. And Bonnie mentioned Caravaggio, and Caravaggio was very influenced by Venetian art, and that just flash of an intense red to kind of capture your attention in this particular direction of the painting. But then down below, where we can see the subtle reflections of her companions there on the shore, waving in distress, the reflections of objects across the surface of the water. It's a completely different application of color, and one that the Venetians would essentially monopolize now. Bonnie mentioned Bassano, right? And how he was part of this particular school. Tintoretto, another of these great Venetian artists. And in fact, his application of color, this kaleidoscope of figures and colors that you see, was a little unnerving, because one of the things that I always do when I have the luxury of being in the Accademia in Venice is to invite my students to walk as close to the painting as they can. Because when you do, you can actually discern the individual brushstrokes that Tintoretto uses. They're quite broad, they're quite big, and they're quite nonsensical. In other words, you look at it, you don't know what it is that you're looking at, but that when you pull away from the painting, they all kind of coalesce into these shapes and into these forms, mixing different color brushstrokes. And in fact, I'm not the only one who's unnerved by this, because remember, Tintoretto was the artist that Vasari accused of painting with a broom. All right, he said his brushstrokes were so rapid and violent that he imagined Tintoretto dipping a broom into a can of paint and then just splashing it onto the surface of his work. But what he's doing is shaping his figures now in color, whether it's the ochre of this woman's dress or the kind of cinnabar red of that man's kind of pseudo armor that you see St. Mark falling into the painting in a dramatic way. It's a whole new visual language that's no longer necessarily just based on that line that was so important to Central Italian artists, but one instead that was very much based on color. Now, this is a painting that's been popping up in my life over and over again over the last few months. I'd actually dedicated an entire podcast to it. I'm also reading a book that concerns Napoleon and all the art that was actually taken from Italy, including this great painted. This is a massive, massive canvas painted by Paolo Veronese that was once in the dining hall of the Benedictine monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore, directly across from San Marco in Venice. And, you know, just this very rich scene, and we talk about how Veronese kind of captures Venetian life in the middle of the 16th century. But at the same time, what cannot be overlooked is just this range of colors that he's introduced. And in its complexity, I mean, it almost gives the impression of a kind of 20th century painting with just dabs of colors, you know, almost random assortment and arrangement of different pigments and different fields in this incredibly dynamic sort of scene. And this is that phase now in Italian art where the Venetians are, of course, taking these colors, combining them and expressing them in completely innovative ways. And all of that would, of course, then reach its peak in the next stylistic period, which, of course, was the Baroque period, where Caravaggio might come along and intensify the use of shadow, but many of his contemporaries with names like Carracci and da Cortona would continue this tradition of using these colors as a means of expression in their artwork. Okay? Now, folks, I'm going to finish up with that particular image, and as Bonnie mentioned, I'll be happy to take questions across the way while we're talking about the great exhibition that's taking place there. So thank you very much, everyone.